There was a time when the television set wasn't just a screen. It was the heart of the home. Big and boxy, humming faintly even when it was off, it sat like a quiet guest in the living room. We didn't decorate around it. We gathered around it. And back then it didn't offer you 1,000 choices. No streaming, no remotes with 50 buttons. Just a little dial and 3 channels, maybe 4 if the weather was kind, and the antenna behaved. And that was enough. Because what mattered wasn't how many shows were on. It was that we watched them together. We didn't each have our own screens. The idea would have been absurd. The living room was the only theater we had. Everyone knew when the shows started. And if you were late, you missed it. No pause, no replay, no I'll watch it later. You watched it now, or not at all. And so we made time. Dinner was done early. Dishes were cleared fast. The couch filled up like church pews. Dad in his chair. Mom folding towels. You on the floor with your legs tucked under you, waiting for that theme song that told you it was time. The whole family watching the same thing at the same time. It sounds small now. It wasn't. That shared laugh when the punchline landed. That collective gasp when the villain got caught. That little glance across the room, did you see that? Even though you knew they did. It was communion. It was community. It was home. And we didn't argue much about what to watch. Not because we all wanted the same thing, but because there were only 3 things to pick from. ABC, CBS, NBC, sometimes PBS. That was it. And somehow that limitation brought us closer. You didn't scroll for half an hour trying to decide. You didn't doom scroll until bedtime and call it entertainment. You sat down. The show started. And for 30 minutes, maybe an hour, you belonged to something together. The programming was predictable, but comforting. Monday night might mean Gunsmoke, or I Love Lucy. Tuesdays were happy days. Thursdays brought The Waltons or Cheers. And Sunday, that was The Wonderful World of Disney. And you better believe we didn't miss that one. You knew what night it was by what was on the screen. TV wasn't background noise. It was the event. And if there was something big on an awards show, a moon landing, the president speaking well, the world just stopped for a little while. Neighbors talked about it. Your teacher brought it up at school. People wrote about it in the paper, because chances were everyone saw it. At the same time, in the same way. That's something we've lost now. We watch alone, with headphones, on different devices, at different times. We live in our own little bubbles of content. But back then, we shared it. Even the commercials were part of the experience. You'd hum the jingles, quote them at the breakfast table. Sometimes Dad would grumble, "These ads are getting longer." But then he'd chuckle when the dog fetched the beer. And let's not forget the antenna. Sometimes you had to get up and adjust the rabbit ears just so. Wrap them in tinfoil. Angle the whole TV a few degrees to the left. Hold your breath and pray the picture stayed steady. And if the screen got snowy mid-show, one brave soul. Usually you had to stand next to the set, one hand on the dial, the other pointing, waiting for someone to shout from the couch, "There, hold it there." You'd stand like a statue for 5 whole minutes. That was your contribution to family bonding. No one ever said thank you, but they didn't have to. You felt it. And that's what made it magic. Everyone had their spot in the living room. It wasn't assigned, not formally, but everyone knew where they belonged. Dad had his recliner worn at the arms, perfectly contoured to the shape of his back, with a little wooden lever he pulled, with the same rhythm every night. Mom sat at the end of the couch closest to the lamp, where she could knit or sort laundry, or keep half an eye on the pot of tea in the kitchen. You usually ended up on the floor, maybe on the rug, maybe leaning against the couch with a pillow hugged to your chest. And if company came over, you scooted aside without a word, because that was just how it worked. There was a quiet choreography to the room that no one ever wrote down, but everyone understood. And once the show came on, something unspoken happened. Conversations quieted. The lighting stayed low. The air seemed to settle. We weren't a perfect family who is, but for those 30 minutes that hour, we were tuned into the same world. We laughed at the same jokes, gasped at the same surprises, and sometimes, just sometimes, even wiped our eyes at the same moment, pretending not to notice that someone else had gone quiet, too. It wasn't about the content of the show, really. It was about the act of watching together. No one had a phone to scroll. No one had a second screen. If you got up to get something, someone would whisper, "You're missing it," and you'd hurry back, not wanting to lose even a moment of whatever was unfolding on that warm, flickering box of light. The commercials gave us breathing room. That's when you'd run to the kitchen, grab a cookie, pour some lemonade, or just stretch your legs. But even then, you listened with one ear in case the show started back up again. And when it did, everyone settled again. Shoulders relaxed, eyes focused, the world briefly held at bay, while the living room became a little theater just for us. It didn't matter if the antenna fuzzed for a second, or if the sound wasn't perfect. It didn't matter if you'd seen the episode before. What mattered was the ritual of it, the way we came together at the same time, night after night, and let ourselves be pulled into stories that weren't ours, but still somehow felt familiar. And that ritual gave the day a kind of rhythm, a heartbeat, that we didn't notice until years later, when the house grew quieter, and we each had our own screens, and watching together became something rare, instead of something assumed. Because back then, that was just how it was. You sat, you watched, you laughed, and for that brief sliver of time, everything else faded out, and it was just you and your people, in the soft glow of the screen, sharing a story. And when the show ended, it didn't just fade into silence. It became the start of a conversation. Someone would comment on what just happened. Someone else would recall a similar moment from their own life. And before long, the room was alive again, but in a softer way. There was something about watching the same thing that leveled the playing field. It didn't matter if you were the oldest sibling or the youngest, if you were tired from work or bored from school, if you all just watched the same twist ending or laughed at the same silly scene. Then for a few minutes afterward, you were on the same page, and in a household where everyone lived such different days, that kind of shared understanding was a gift. Sometimes the television stayed on a little longer, playing whatever came on next, while you slowly began your nighttime routines. Sometimes Dad would say, "All right, lights out," and the set would go dark with a soft click that seemed to echo through the quiet house. And sometimes when the night was warm and the day had been long, you'd all just sit there for a little while longer, no one saying much, no one needing to, and the silence wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, the kind of silence that only comes from feeling safe and full, like your day had ended just the way it should. There were fights, of course, disagreements, Times when someone wanted to watch one show and someone else had their heart set on another. But even those moments didn't last long, because it wasn't really about the show. It was about the being together, and we knew that, even if we didn't say it. What's funny is when people talk about family time now, they mean vacations or board games or planned dinners. But for us, family time often came from simply watching, sharing a couch, sharing a laugh, sharing the kind of quiet that only exists when everyone is comfortable enough not to fill the air. So yes, we all had our favorite chairs, our well-worn cushions and personal routines. But when the screen lit up and the theme song played, we shared more than a room. We shared a rhythm, a pause, a moment we didn't even realize was precious until it was gone. We didn't have a remote. And even if some people did, we certainly weren't one of them, not for a long time, at least. There was no clicking buttons from across the room, no scrolling through menus with your thumb, no lying back while the channels flipped like cards in a magician's hand. If you wanted to change the channel, you got up, walked over, turned the dial with an audible clunk. That was the rule. And because of that, you didn't flip channels endlessly. You committed. You sat through what was on and you made peace with it. Sometimes that meant watching a show you didn't love. Sometimes it meant catching the end of the news when you really wanted cartoons. But most of the time, it meant discovering something new, not because an algorithm suggested it, but because you were already there, and it just happened to start. That kind of patience built something in us. It taught us how to sit still, how to lean into a story we didn't choose, how to wait for the good part, even if it took 20 minutes to get there. And that waiting made the laughter louder, the drama sharper, the endings more satisfying. Sometimes the dial would stick, or you'd skip right past Channel 3 and have to circle all the way back around. Sometimes the picture would roll, or the sound would fuzz, and you'd give the top of the TV a little slap, not too hard, but just enough to remind it who was boss. And sometimes the whole screen would flash and settle back in with a sigh, like the set itself was trying to keep up with your evening. You learned to respect the machine, and when you were the youngest, you were the remote. You'd hear, "Turn it to Channel 7, and up you'd go groaning, but doing it anyway. You'd spin the dial, step back, wait for someone to say too far, go back one, then spin it again. Sometimes you'd try to sneak in a show you liked better, hoping no one noticed until it was too far in to change. They always noticed, but they'd usually let it slide, if only for a few minutes, because we all knew the effort it took just to get back up again. You didn't channel surf. You didn't watch passively. The act of getting up made the decision matter. You thought about it first. You chose with intention, and more often than not, you stuck with what you chose because it was easier than arguing or standing again or adjusting the antenna one more time. That kind of stillness created something we rarely feel now, presence. We were with the show, not distracted by what else we might be watching. We weren't toggling between 5 apps, glancing at our phones, muting during the slow parts. We were in it, even when it dragged, even when it was a rerun, even when it wasn't quite what we wanted. And maybe that's why those stories stuck with us, because we gave them our full attention. Even the act of turning the set on was deliberate. You twisted the knob, heard the electric buzz as the tube warmed up, and watched the screen bloom from a white dot in the middle outward, like the television was waking up, slowly stretching its limbs before it got to work. It didn't just start, it arrived. And in that moment you settled too. Everything about it said, "Slow down. Be here." And in a strange way, that's what the lack of a remote gave us. It gave us permission not to change the channel, not just the physical one, but the emotional one, to stay in a moment longer, to see it through, to discover that maybe the show you didn't think you'd enjoy was the one you'd remember decades later. You didn't need endless options. You just needed one that worked, and you were willing to get up for it. And there was a kind of quiet dignity in that effort, wasn't there? In the act of getting up and making the decision with your whole body, not just your fingers. It reminded you that watching TV wasn't meant to be endless or mindless. It was something you did. You chose it. You showed up for it. And when it was done, you turned it off and moved on with your evening. There was no autoplay, no infinite scroll, just a moment, and then it passed. Sometimes you didn't even switch channels at all. You just left the set on whatever it was already tuned to. And maybe that meant you caught an old Western rerun or a local program you'd never paid attention to before. But that's how you found your favorites, not by curating them, but by accident. And those accidental discoveries often became the ones you looked forward to most. You didn't worry about the best resolution or surround sound or perfect pixels. The picture was what it was, grainy, sometimes washed out, if the sun hit the screen wrong, dark, if the antenna wasn't quite right. But somehow it didn't matter. You leaned in. You adjusted your expectations, not the machine. And in doing so, you taught yourself to be content with enough. Enough story. Enough light. Enough togetherness. And looking back now, with everything so fast, so bright, so full of choice, you realize how rare it was to sit down, make one choice, and stay with it until the credits rolled. No skipping, no second screen, no comment section. Just you and the flickering glow of a story unfolding one scene at a time. There was no alarm clock set for Saturday mornings, and yet you always woke up early. Not because you had to, but because something inside you wanted to. An excitement that lived in your chest from the night before. A feeling that started to rise even before the sun did. You'd open your eyes, still half dreaming, and for a moment you'd forget why you were awake so early. But then it would hit you cartoons. It was Saturday, and that meant a morning that belonged to you. No school, no shoes, no schedule. Just bare feet on cold tile cereal boxes taller than your head, and the television waiting, already humming gently with color bars or a test pattern, maybe even a public service announcement that only made you more impatient. You'd flip the knob dial in the right channel, maybe wiggle the antenna just a little, and there it was, the lineup. And it wasn't just one show, it was a block. A marathon of joy, one right after the other, each with their own theme song, their own characters, their own weird little world. There was Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, chasing and bickering and laughing in ways that only made sense to kids. There were talking animals, superpowered, squirrels, caped crusaders, and clumsy dogs solving mysteries in a van. There were colors and sounds and voices that you could mimic. Without even thinking lines you'd repeat to your friends on Monday, sketches that made you laugh so hard you snorted milk through your nose. You sat cross-legged on the rug, or maybe curled up on the couch in your pajamas' cereal bowl, balanced dangerously on your knees. The milk was always too sweet, the spoon always too big, but none of it mattered. The house was quiet, except for the TV, the occasional creak of floorboards, and the sound of your own laughter. It was your time, a kind of sacred bubble. No adults changing the channel, no one telling you to get ready, just a long stretch of colorful nonsense designed just for you. And there was something beautiful in how low-tech it all was. No DVR, no pause. If you missed it, you missed it. You had to be there, had to catch it live. And that urgency made it feel special, like the world had built a secret tunnel that only opened once a week, and you were lucky enough to slip through it before it closed again. You knew the schedule by heart. Not because you looked it up online, there was no online, but because you learned it. You felt it. Scooby-Doo came on right after the Flintstones. The Jetsons followed something else, and around 10:30, the shows started to shift. Less cartoons, more local programming, the fun starting to fade a soft signal that the magic was ending, and the regular weekend was beginning. But for those 2, maybe 3 hours, the world belonged to kids. No politics, no bad news, no grown-up interruptions. Just characters who made mistakes, learned lessons, and always wrapped things up by the time the credits rolled. And maybe it sounds silly now. Maybe Saturday morning cartoons don't mean much in a world where you can stream any show, anytime, on any device. But that's exactly the point. Back then, you had to wait, had to earn it, had to build your whole week around that one stretch of freedom. And when it came, you gave it everything. You sat a little closer, laughed a little louder, felt a little more alive. And when the shows ended, and you wandered into the kitchen still humming the theme song, you carried that lightness with you. The rest of the day felt better because of how it started. You'd grab your bike, or your coloring book, or go knock on your friend's door, and you'd both already be smiling because you'd both been watching the same shows at the same time from 2 different houses. And that connection, that invisible thread of joy, that's something no algorithm can recreate. And sometimes, if you were lucky, your siblings would still be asleep, and you'd have the whole couch to yourself. You'd stretch out toes poking under the edge of a blanket, one arm hanging off the side eyes glued to the screen, while the rest of the world slowly stirred awake. The kitchen would come alive in the background, the sound of coffee, brewing a spoon clinking against a mug, the low murmur of grown-ups starting their day. But you were already on your second bowl of cereal, still in that bright, happy place where cats chased mice and ducks outsmarted everyone, and not a single problem lasted longer than 11 minutes. There was comfort in the predictability. You knew the dog would always catch the bad guy. The bad guy would always slip on a banana peel, and everyone would always end up okay. And for a kid, living in a world where so many things were confusing and out of your control, those little loops of chaos resolving into laughter gave you a strange, soothing sense of order. You could count on those cartoons the same way you counted on the sun rising and Mom calling you in for lunch. And later in life, years, even decades later, those theme songs still echoed in your head. A phrase here, a melody there. You'd hear them on a commercial or hum them in the car without realizing, And suddenly you were 8 years old again, sitting too close to the screen, laughing through a mouthful of cornflakes. The characters faded. The shows changed. But the feeling stayed. That quiet, cozy joy of being awake early, not because you had to, but because something delightful was waiting for you. Not everything on TV was for fun. Some things were big, and when those things happened, whether it was a moon landing, a presidential address, the Olympics, or a breaking news bulletin that interrupted your regular program, everything changed in the room. The light seemed to shift. People got quiet. You sat a little straighter, leaned in a little closer, because this wasn't just a show. It was a moment, and you knew even as a kid that it mattered. It might have started with someone calling from the kitchen, "Turn it on, quick." Or maybe Dad was already in his chair, finger on the dial, saying, "This is history right here." And suddenly the room that had been filled with cartoons and cereal and sleepy morning sun was now bathed in the glow of something serious, something live, something that everyone in the country was watching at the exact same time. And that was a kind of magic we don't have anymore, because there was something powerful in the knowing that millions of people in houses just like yours were seeing the same thing, hearing the same voice, holding their breath through the same moments. No spoilers, no time zones to dodge, no second screen to distract. Just you, your family, and the rest of the country watching together. And it wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was joyful. A baseball game that went into extra innings. The Muppets performing on a holiday special. A royal wedding. And in those cases, you'd laugh or cheer or nudge the person next to you when something sweet or silly happened. It felt like being part of something bigger, even if you never left your living room. There were shows that weren't even shows in the usual sense, but everyone watched them like they were. The evening news, the State of the Union, the Challenger launch, the Berlin Wall coming down. People tuned in not because they were told to, but because they wanted to understand the world outside their front door, and TV was how we saw it. And for kids, it was a strange and wonderful education. You sat there maybe a little confused at first, but you stayed because the adults stayed. You asked questions. Why are they clapping? What's Watergate? Is that really the moon? And the answers you got weren't always simple, but they stuck with you. You remembered the way your parents looked at the screen, the way they whispered to each other during commercials, the way no one got up when the president was speaking, the way the room held still. And later, years later, you remembered being there, not at the event, but at the watching. And that became part of the memory, too, because back then, watching TV wasn't passive. It was an act. It was something you did, not just something that happened to you. You dressed a little nicer for the Kennedy funeral. You stayed up late for the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. You gathered around with popcorn for the Oscars. And when it was over, you didn't just turn it off and move on. You talked about it. You processed it as a family. You asked questions, you shared opinions, you wrote down the names of songs you liked or movies you wanted to see. It wasn't content, it was conversation. Even commercials felt different during those moments. You paid attention. You'd whisper during them, but never over the news anchor. You respected the screen, because you understood that something important was happening, even if you didn't know all the details. That's the thing about those big moments. They had weight, and the television helped carry it. And when it was over, when the broadcast ended, and the screen faded to black or static, you sat there a moment longer, not because you were waiting for something else, but because you needed time to come back, to shift back into your world, to process what you'd just seen. And sometimes you didn't say anything. You just got up, stretched, and went to bed. But inside you something had shifted. You knew a little more, understood a little more, felt a little more connected to the rest of the world. And today, when you remember those moments, you don't remember them as clips on a screen. You remember them as events, something shared, something still. And you remember the room, who was sitting where, how quiet it got, how real it felt. Because when something big was on, we all watched. Not every television memory was tied to a big moment or a scheduled primetime slot. Some of the ones that stayed with you the longest came from the slow drifting hours of summer, those endless afternoons when the sun hung high, the house was too quiet, and time seemed to soften around the edges. That was rerun season. And for kids especially, it was a quiet kind of magic. You'd wander in from the backyard, sweaty and grass-stained, or maybe you were just lying on your stomach on the living room rug, a fan humming beside you, bored but content. And there it was, the TV already on, maybe left that way from the morning news, flickering softly in the background. A show you'd seen before, probably more than once. And yet, you stayed. You knew every line, every gag, every twist. But that didn't matter. In fact, that was why you watched. Because reruns weren't just recycled content. They were comfort. They were old friends stopping by unannounced. You didn't have to focus. You didn't have to follow the plot. You just let it wash over you like warm air through an open window. You didn't need new stories every day. Sometimes you just needed to hear something familiar. There was a different rhythm to those afternoons. No one was in a rush. You weren't checking the clock. The chores could wait, and so could dinner. And the show didn't demand anything from you. It was happy to just be there, in the background, holding space, keeping you company. Maybe it was Gilligan's Island, maybe it was the Andy Griffith Show, maybe it was Bewitched or I Dream of Jeannie. But whatever it was, it carried with it a kind of timelessness, like it existed outside of your day. You could tune in halfway through and still enjoy it. You could doze off and wake up to the same laugh track looping again, and you weren't the only one. Somewhere in another living room, your best friend was probably watching the same rerun. Your cousin in another town. Your grandma in her recliner. That's how shared culture used to work. You didn't plan it. You didn't schedule a group chat around it. You just happened to be living the same moment in different places, and that was enough. There was something grounding in that kind of repetition. You knew what to expect. The theme song always hit the same notes. The intro never changed. The jokes still landed, even if you could recite them in your sleep. It wasn't boring, it was safe. It was a reminder that not everything in life had to be new to be meaningful. And for some of us, those summer reruns were how we found certain shows for the first time. Maybe they aired before we were born. Maybe we missed them during the school year. But the rerun was a second chance, a quiet invitation to fall in love with something that had already passed through the world once before. Sometimes you'd watch with a sibling. Sometimes you'd watch alone. Sometimes you'd half-watch while flipping through a comic or braiding a daisy chain. But you were there, and the show was too. And when the episode ended, you didn't rush to the next. There was no autoplay, no cliffhanger pulling you forward. Just the credits, the theme song again, maybe a fade to black. And you sat there not because you were waiting for more, but because you were satisfied. And looking back now, you realize how rare that feeling is. The comfort of enough, the ease of familiarity, the quiet joy of seeing something old and feeling it land just as warmly as it did the first time. Reruns weren't filler. They were ritual. They were how we slowed down when the world got too loud. They were how we remembered how to rest. And maybe that's why even now when you stumble across one of those old shows on cable, or late at night, or buried in a streaming service, you still stop. Still smile. Still hum the tune without realizing. Because those shows didn't just pass the time. They shaped it, softened it, and gave you a little place to land again and again and again. There was a time when television didn't run all night. It had a bedtime, just like we did. And if you stayed up late enough, maybe on a Friday night during summer, or after a long holiday gathering, when you were too full to sleep, you'd see something that felt almost mystical, almost solemn. You'd be sitting there, the last one awake, the house wrapped in shadows, the TV casting its pale glow across the room, and suddenly the programming would end. No flashy transitions, no countdown to the next thing, just a quiet fade. A soft voice maybe thanking you for watching. The playing of the national anthem, sometimes with a waving flag or old footage of eagles and open fields. And then the screen would shift to something strange, and still a test pattern. It was usually a circle with thick bars of color, or grayscale, maybe a tuning grid, maybe a clock. Sometimes it hummed, sometimes it buzzed, sometimes it was just silent like a closed door. And even as a child, you felt the finality in it. You understood somehow that the TV wasn't broken. It was sleeping, resting, like everything else in the world should be. And that felt right. You'd sit there a moment longer, the room still, your thoughts drifting, your body growing heavier with the weight of the hour. The world outside your window had gone quiet. No cars, no voices, no flickers of porch lights. And the test pattern on the screen was a gentle nudge. It's time to stop now. It's okay to let go. And so you would. You'd turn the knob slowly, softly, until the screen shrank to a glowing dot, and then vanished completely. You'd sit in the dark for just a beat, the silence rich and deep. Then you'd rise careful not to wake anyone, and make your way to bed, the image of that test pattern still flickering behind your eyes. There was something oddly comforting about it, knowing the world didn't go on forever, knowing there was an end to the day, that even the noisiest machine had to rest, that the people who made the shows, the anchors who read the news, the crews who ran the cameras, they all had homes too. Lights off, doors closed, feet up. It gave you permission to stop watching, to stop waiting, to simply be done. And now, in a time when screens never sleep, when something is always playing, always flashing, always begging for your attention, you realize what a gift that was. The quiet, the stillness, the boundary. There was no fear of missing out, no autoplay countdown, No never-ending scroll. Just a screen saying gently, "That's all for today." And it made the next day feel fresh. When the programming resumed, usually with the morning news or children's shows, you were ready for it, because the pause had created space, anticipation, a little bit of longing that made the return feel like a reunion. Even the sound of the sign-off was etched into your memory. The swell of the anthem, the static hiss, the pop as the set turned off. These were not interruptions, they were closures. The kind of closure that told your brain, your heart, your spirit, it's okay now. Go rest. And in a world that often seems too fast, too loud, too full, you miss that. You miss the strange beauty of an empty screen, the dignity of turning things off, the sacredness of the end. And sometimes you didn't stay up that late by choice. Maybe you couldn't sleep. Maybe the house was too quiet, too still, and your thoughts too loud. Maybe you wandered into the living room after midnight barefoot, wrapping a blanket around your shoulders, and clicked on the set just for company. You weren't really watching anything in particular. You just didn't want to feel alone. And that hum from the test pattern, that soft buzz from the speaker, somehow it helped. It was proof that something was still running, still breathing, still out there in the dark with you. It didn't ask anything of you. It didn't judge your insomnia or your wandering mind. It just sat there steady and unchanged and let you be. Sometimes there'd be nothing on but the weather radar, a slow sweep of green and blue circles, static lines marking cities you barely recognized, and a little clock in the corner, ticking the minutes past midnight. And you'd sit, not because it was interesting, but because it was quiet. Because in a strange way, it felt like the world was whispering back to you, "I'm here. I'm calm. I'm resting. You can, too." And when the signal finally cut out, when the screen faded to black or gray snow, you didn't panic or fumble for a solution. You nodded. You understood. It was the end of the day. It was time to let it go. We've lost that rhythm now. These days, there's no visual lullaby, no final message saying good night, no slow fade. You can binge watch until sunrise. The shows never stop. The screen never sleeps. And for all that endless access, something essential has slipped away. Because the sign-off wasn't just for the TV. It was for you. A reminder that nothing has to run forever. That even the things that keep us connected deserve rest. That silence isn't an absence. It's a gift. And in those final moments when the flag waved, the anthem played, the screen grew dim, you learned something sacred, that endings can be beautiful too. Long before the internet gave us instant updates and real-time alerts, the news came to us in one steady rhythm every evening after dinner, on the same channel, delivered by the same calm, familiar voices. The local news wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. It was dependable. And for many of us, it was the last thing we watched before the world grew quiet and we turned in for the night. The anchors weren't celebrities. They weren't trying to go viral or stir up drama. They were neighbors in a way, sitting there each night in their suits and ties, reading headlines with steady tones and patient eyes. Their names were familiar, their smiles reassuring. And even if you didn't catch every word, just having them on in the background made the house feel settled, like everything was in its place. You'd recognize their cadence, the way they transitioned between segments, the subtle inflection that meant a story was sad or funny. or important. You trusted them even if you didn't always understand the bigger picture, and they never seemed rushed. They gave each story room to breathe. And then came the weather. The maps were simple. No spinning globes, no high-tech 3D radar, just a man with a pointer and a wall of static graphics. Sun cloud, lightning bolt, a little snowflake for flair. But you listened. You learned. You knew what those cold fronts meant. You knew how to tell a bad thunderstorm was coming just by the way he paused before saying, "Gusty winds." And you planned your day around it. "Better bring the umbrella tomorrow," Dad would mutter. "Looks like a scorcher," someone would say, fanning themselves with a napkin. And the sports usually near the end, often with a touch of humor. The local high school scores the Little League highlights, sometimes a short clip of a crowd cheering somewhere downtown. You didn't need a full recap, just a moment. Just a reminder that there were games being played, goals being scored, and victories worth sharing, even on a quiet Tuesday night. There was something soothing about the structure of it all. You knew the format, you knew the order, you knew the timing, and by the time they reached the closing sign-off, "Thanks for watching, we'll see you tomorrow," you felt ready to rest. The TV didn't shout at you. It didn't try to sell you outrage. It just told you what happened in your town, in your world. And then it stopped. Some nights you'd drift off before the weather was even done. Other nights you'd watch all the way through, still half listening as the credits rolled, and the station faded into something soft and slow. But either way, it was part of your routine. A quiet, unassuming ritual that helped close the day. You don't realize how much those small things matter until they're gone. The predictability, the gentleness, the familiar faces you never actually met, but somehow still miss. Because those weren't just newscasters, they were part of your evening, part of your living room, part of your life. And now, with the constant churn of headlines and the endless scroll of bad news, you remember those days with a kind of aching fondness. Back when the news fit into a half hour, back when the weather felt like a forecast and not a production, back when someone said good night from the screen, and it actually meant something. And maybe you still catch a local broadcast every now and then. Maybe one of those old anchors is still around, their voice a little softer, their hair a little grayer, but still delivering the same steady calm. And when you see them, even for a second, you smile, because it takes you back to a room filled with lamplight and the hum of a box fan, to the rustle of a newspaper on the couch beside you, to the sound of someone in the kitchen washing the last of the dishes, to the sense that the world was still turning, but slowly, gently, kindly. And in that memory there's comfort, because even now you can hear that voice signing off, still steady, still warm, still wishing you well. Thanks for being with us tonight. Sleep tight. And then there were the commercials, simple local, sometimes a little clumsy, but completely unforgettable. You'd see the same furniture store owner standing stiffly in front of a sofa, set waving awkwardly, while his kid shouted the phone number into the camera. There were jingles that lived in your head for years and faces that popped up every week, like members of the extended family. A used car dealership, a bowling alley, a bakery that always had a new coupon. These weren't polished ad campaigns. They were part of the town, and even when you rolled your eyes or chuckled at how low budget they looked, you watched. Because you knew those places. You drove past them. Your aunt worked there. Your neighbor's son was in the commercial last year. The news wasn't just national or global. It was your neighborhood, wrapped into a half hour before bedtime. Sometimes there'd be a community announcement, a fundraiser at the church, a notice about school closures, lost dogs, missing cats, local heroes. It was all woven in not flashy, not breaking news, but meaningful in the quiet way that only local news could be. And when the screen finally dimmed and the music faded out, you felt the soft landing of another day well closed. Maybe the anchor gave a little smile at the end or a line you didn't quite catch. But it stayed with you, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ours, familiar, gentle, and just enough. Having guests over always changed the dynamic just a little, didn't it? Not in a bad way, just enough to shift the energy of the room. The chairs were rearranged. Someone pulled in the kitchen stool. The older kids had to sit on the floor again, and there was usually a little extra noise, a few more laughs, the soft clink of a spoon in a teacup as someone stirred without looking up. But no matter how many people were over, or how much conversation floated through the house, once the TV came on, there was a natural settling. You didn't say, "Let's watch something." You just turned it on. Maybe it was the game. Maybe the news, maybe a variety show or an old comedy rerun. But whatever it was, everyone gravitated toward it, like moths to light. The living room filled, people shuffled into their spots, and just like that the air quieted. There were rules unspoken but firmly understood. The remote, if you had one, belonged to the host. The volume didn't go too high, even when the room was full. No one stood in front of the screen for long. And when the commercials came, that was your cue to talk briefly, lightly, before the show resumed. Guests didn't demand anything. They watched what the family was watching. If you were lucky, you'd all find something that pleased everyone. A game show was always a safe bet. Everyone loved shouting out answers. A comedy special, even better. There's nothing quite like laughing together with people you don't see every day. And when someone made a joke that landed right as the host did, the room would erupt, half in laughter, half in the joy of timing. And when the show got serious or the movie reached its climax, the room would go still. Quiet. You could hear the air conditioner humming the occasional creak of the coffee table, someone gently setting their glass down on a coaster. No one had to say, "Shh." Everyone just knew. That's the kind of respect we had for the moment, for each other, for the show. We let the story do its work. Sometimes a guest would say something during a quiet scene and get a dozen side eyes. Or a kid would ask too many questions and someone would nudge them gently with a whisper, "You can ask after." And they'd learn the way we all did what it meant to watch with people, not just in the same room, but together. If someone needed to get up to use the bathroom, check on the oven, grab a snack, they'd wait for a lull. And if the phone rang, no one answered it. Or if they did, they whispered and stepped into the hall. Because nothing short of an emergency was worth missing a moment. And when the show ended, the conversation began again. What did you think? Did you see that twist coming? I forgot how good that one was. The credits played softly in the background, and someone usually turned the volume down a bit, as the room returned to itself. The spell broke, but gently. You didn't need popcorn. You didn't need a big screen. You just needed the people, the story, and the space to share it. And later, after the guests had gone home, after the dishes were done, and the last chair pushed back into place, someone would say, "That was nice," and you'd know exactly what they meant. Not just the visit, the whole thing, the sitting together, the watching together. Because when you watch TV with guests, it wasn't just about entertainment. It was about shared memory. It was about having a common thread to talk about, to laugh about, to remember. And even now, when you flip through old shows or catch a scene from a long-ago movie, you remember more than the plot. You remember who was there, who sat on the edge of the ottoman, who laughed the loudest, who stayed until the very end. You remember the night, not just the screen. And that's the power of watching together. When the final scene faded and the credits began to roll, no one jumped up right away. There was no scramble to check phones, no rush to click into something else. We let the credits play. Not because we were reading them, not because we needed to know who the grip was or which studio handled the lighting, but because it gave us a moment, a soft landing, a gentle shift from the story back into our own world. Sometimes the music would swell and someone would hum along. Sometimes the room stayed quiet, everyone just sitting there soaking it in. And sometimes, even before the names finished scrolling, the conversation would begin. That ending, though. You remember when that first came out? I can't believe I forgot about that scene. And just like that, the television became background again, and we came forward fully present, human. The screen had given us something, and now we passed it between us like warm bread at a table, replaying moments, laughing at callbacks, debating the little details we each remembered differently. In those minutes after the show ended, something opened. A kind of honesty, a soft vulnerability that came not from the story itself, but from having shared it. From sitting side by side, hearts briefly aligned by the rhythm of a narrative. Sometimes those post-show moments drifted into memories. Grandpa loved that character. We used to watch this when we still lived in the old house. Remember when the antenna snapped in the middle of the finale, and we had to wait a whole year for the rerun? And in that remembering, we connected again, not just to each other, but to ourselves, to who we were, who we are, who we've been through all those flickering hours in the glow of the screen. And even when the TV clicked off and the lights dimmed and someone began tidying up, the feeling stayed. It carried into bedtime, into dreams, into the way we woke up the next morning, gentler, perhaps, more aware of the people around us, more grounded in the beauty of having watched something together. Because the credits didn't mean the story was over. They meant it had settled in. And years later, we remember those nights, not for the plot, not for the cinematography or the ratings or the cast list, but for the pause, the stillness, the conversation that came after, the way we didn't rush, the way we stayed. The best nights weren't the ones where the show blew our minds. They were the ones where we lingered after, where the story gave us an excuse to sit a little closer, to speak a little softer, to stay just a little longer in the quiet company of people we love. And now, as the world spins a little faster, and the noise never really stops, We remember what it felt like to let the credits roll and to stay in the moment they made possible. So here we are with the volume turned low and the room grown still, and maybe you're remembering a night like that. A soft chair, a warm blanket, the smell of popcorn or the clink of ice in a glass, someone you loved sitting next to you, someone else laughing down the hall. The show has ended, the credits have rolled, and there's no need to click away just yet. Let that silence hold you a little longer. Let it wrap around your shoulders like the old quilt folded at the end of your childhood bed. Let it carry you back to those nights when stories were shared, not streamed, when the end of a program meant the beginning of a memory, when the screen faded to black and the world around you glowed just a little warmer for it. You're not alone in remembering. Across miles, across years, someone else is thinking of the same theme song, the same closing line, the same final note that meant it was time to sleep, but only after one last smile, one last word, one last breath of gratitude. Sleep well tonight. The screen is quiet. The story has settled, and everything's just where it should be.